I'll read the description of this first session. Phillips Brooks, who was an Episcopalian bishop, I think in Boston 100 years ago, Phillips Brooks once described preaching as, quote, the communication of truth through personality. Very good. That's probably the best definition of preaching that I know. If this is true of preaching, and it is even more true of disciple-making. For, whereas many hearers will observe the preacher's person only at a distance, the disciple-maker's person is deeply involved in the discipling process. At the 2014 forum, the network leaders, the three of us, collected questions from participants regarding the person discipling others. The responses fell under various categories. First, the discipler's life. Life on life means not only saint to saint, but also sinner to sinner. When can we really say to others, be imitators of me as I am of Christ? 1 Corinthians 11:1. Second, the discipler's personality type. What role does it play? Third, the discipler's ability. How can it be developed? Also the question, is this something every believer can and should do? Or is it, like preaching, something for the specifically gifted? Fourth, the discipler's status. If I'm not the pastor, how do I get the permission of the church? I thought those were excellent questions. So we took them down and decided we have to answer them this year. Too late for them, but good for you, hopefully. So I put everything in, try it again to this time with C. The first is, do I have the calling and the conviction to go along with it? Second, do I have the character that it takes? Third, do I have the competence? And fourth, do I have the credentials? And I'll explain that later. So do I have the calling to do this and the conviction that I should do this? I'll say a few words on that. I think a lot of you already have this calling and conviction, so they don't need this for themselves, but then again you may, and also you definitely need it for the people that you're training, because you want them to carry this on, and they may ask these very questions. Well, why should I? Do I have what it takes? Should I do this? So, how do you argue for everybody having the calling? Can you argue for everybody having the calling? Well, the first you always read is, go make disciples. That's the Great Commission. Doesn't it say, go make disciples? Well, you could always argue yourself out of that. You could say, and this is not entirely wrong, this is a commission given to the church as a whole. And it involves a certain division of labor. So not everything necessarily applies to everybody. Like it says, baptizing them. I'm not a pastor myself. I've never baptized a person. Am I being guilty of not obeying the Great Commission? Well, I work for a parachurch group. People who become believers with us, we send them to church and they baptize them. I don't feel very guilty. But somebody who's pedantic could say, you're not fulfilling in your person. Or we're supposed to go to the ends of the earth. Well, I stayed in Germany. Should I be ashamed of not going to Japan? So there is a certain division of labor, and so somebody might say, perhaps even this call, go make disciples, also involves, if I'm not a preacher, perhaps I'm not supposed to be a disciple maker. The answer is wrong, I think, but it's plausible. You can't just say, it says it, do it. Yeah. So how do you argue then? 1 Corinthians 11:1, and it sort of gets more focused now. Where Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." And theologians have started calling that in Latin the imitatio Pauli, the imitation. There's the imitatio Christi and the imitatio Pauli. And some people say, why don't you tell them to imitate Christ? Why do you tell them to imitate you, of all people? Yeah, who are you that they should imitate you instead of imitating Christ? And there the answer is always, you have to incarnate for your time what following Christ means. Like, do Christians smoke? In Jesus' day, they hadn't invented cigarettes yet. So you cannot say, if Jesus didn't smoke, you shouldn't smoke. Because what if there had been cigarettes? Would he have smoked? So you have to... Discipleship comes in a context. And so you have to model in a context. And like, I went to law school. The exams are so tough. Jesus never went to law school. I needed somebody to model somebody older in my navigator group to model how do you, as a Christian, walk through the final exams of law school without cheating, because everybody else cheats. If you become a Christian, you're in the very unfortunate position that you can no longer cheat. My son once told me, you were so lucky in school that you were not a Christian yet, because everybody cheats and I'm not allowed to cheat. What is the imitatio Pauli? You have to... And it gets closer there. You cannot talk yourself out of that. Well, he was an apostle. I'm not an apostle, but we no longer have apostles, at least not in the narrower sense. So does that mean that ever since the apostolic age ended, there was no longer any modeling? Of course, this applies to everyone. And I love this quote from Don Carson in this book, From the Resurrection to His Return. It's a little booklet. I think they have a copy or two here. It's a very slim booklet. And he says this: do you ever say to a young Christian, do you want to know what Christianity is like? Watch me. If you never do, you're unbiblical. After all, the Apostle Paul can write elsewhere. Elsewhere, he's exegeting the 2 Timothy. Yeah? He can write elsewhere, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ, the verse we just talked about. You who are older should be looking out for younger people and saying, in effect, watch me. Come, I'll show you how to have family devotions. Come, I will show you how to do Bible study. Come on, let me take you through some of the fundamentals of the faith. Come, I'll show you how to pray. Let me show you how to be a Christian husband and father, or wife or mother. Then he could have added, let me show you how a Christian does his secular job. And he ends with this note: at a certain point in life, that older mentor should be saying other things, such as, let me show you how to die. Watch me. I think a very good quote that we need older people to model things for. So actually, with 1 Corinthians 11:1, you've sort of established your case. This is for everybody. But the verse I love particularly is Galatians 3:29. And if you are Christ's, then you're Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. I work for the Navigators, and the founder, Dawson Trotman, he always spoke of spiritual generations. And he always referred to God taking Abraham out of the tent and saying, look at the stars. That shall be the number of your offspring. And he thought in generations. And then he made this big point, like with Galatians 3:29, spiritual generations work the same way. God wants every Christian to have spiritual children. They may also be his biological children at the same time, but spiritual children who then also would have spiritual children. And I know the heartache of people who can't have children, married people who can't have children. they would love to have children, and grandparents, they love to show pictures of their grandchildren, almost more so than of their children. And this actually should apply exactly the same way with spiritual children. We should be saying, listen, I led this guy to Christ, or I don't like that expression really. Through my influence, he became a believer, and you know what? He went to his parents and talked to them, and they became children, so that actually makes me a spiritual grandfather. And let me show you a picture of the parents of the guy that became believer. This is old Mr. So-and-so and old Mrs. So-and-so. They became believers at age 67 and 65. Yeah, I'm so proud of them. Why don't we show that kind of pictures? That's what we should be doing. So Galatians 3:29 also says we should be into. So the conclusion actually is each one teach one. And the answer is, do I have the calling? Yeah, you do. You should be having this. Okay, next, personality types. And again, quoting from Judy's book, without permission. And what about my personality? By nature, I, in this case Judy, am very contented to be alone. In fact, I get worn out by people more quickly than others. And in spite of my many years of working closely with women, I still score low on relational scales in personality tests. I could easily remind the Lord that I'm not naturally equipped to get so involved with others. There's an interesting definition between introverts and extroverts. A lot of people think extroverts are the ones who are constantly talking, and introverts are the ones who are silent. It's not at all true. The definition is, do people energize you? Then you're an extrovert. Or do they drain you? Then you're an introvert. And I know a good friend of mine, he is a quiet extrovert. He's always around people, but he's always listening. He very rarely speaks, but he needs to be among people. And then I know a lady who is an incessant talker and a strong introvert. So you have the wrong impression sometimes in your mind. So disciple making, and sometimes I say evangelicalism, or 80% of the evangelical books are written by extroverts for extroverts. What do the introverts do then?
Try to become extroverts.
Good. Finally, somebody understands what it's all about. Okay, but personality types. What difference would that make? Like, if Judy had really prayed this prayer of God and said, that's not for me. Disciple making drains you, so give me a job that doesn't drain you. And God said no. Or if she had asked, he would have said no. Yeah? But what practical difference would you guys guess it would make whether you're an extrovert or an introvert? What influence would that have on the nature of your disciple making? But I wrote here, like begets like. We have to make sure that in disciple making, not everybody thinks like John Musselman. I have to become like John Musselman, and if he is sort of a certain kind of personality, okay, I'm going to model. I'll try to be that kind of. It doesn't work that way. Yeah? Also, like begets like. We pass on our strengths and our weaknesses. Like, thank you. I got the sign. How long? I was always, when I became a believer, I was a big Bible reader, but I always had problems with prayer and evangelism. I had to work on those. And so people I meet with may have the same pattern then, which is not good. because who knows, perhaps they're gifted for differently, not just perhaps, they will be different. And it makes me think, I once had a tennis instruction book when I was a boy, a teenager, where every shot, serve, forehand, backhand, volley, smash, was explained by some world-class player who had that as his best shot, like Pancho Gonzalez's serve, etc. And that was a very bad choice because it didn't tell you much. Pancho Gonzalez, he was so natural with his serve. Actually, all he could say is just throw the ball up and hit it as hard as you can. It's that easy. Yeah? So what they should have said is, let us get world-class players together, but everybody talks about his weakest shot and how he makes do. For example, I don't have a gift of prayer, so so that's what I tell my people, I have to force myself to pray, and this is how I do it. When I sit in the bus or the streetcar, rather than look out the window, I determine to pray through the whole bus, for every person that's in the bus. Who knows, they have never been prayed for in their life. So that's one trick that a non-prayer can use or there is a corner where the cars come around the corner when you wait for the traffic light. I make a point of, since they have to slow down and they're right there with you, I look at every face and pray for them for a second. That's the tricks, prayer tricks of somebody who, like, was it Ayuth Fernando this morning who said, people who say, I always pray and that's why I never pray. That's the kind of person I tend to be. I have a hard time making time for prayer, so I resort to and so that's like a tennis book where somebody has to write on his weak shot, because suddenly those become very pass-onable ideas. Whereas if, like I have a friend, if you ask him, can you lead? I once did that, big mistake. In the program, we have 20 minutes here for prayer. Please lead the group for 20 minutes, but don't go overtime. We'll have a massive problem if you go overtime. Well, of course he did, because that's his gift. And later I came to him. I didn't interrupt him. You don't interrupt prayer. But I said, how long do you think you led us in prayer? And he said, 20 minutes. And I said, 45 minutes. That happens when somebody's gifted. Yeah. So, 5 minutes. Do I have the credentials? I think part of this is what I think I noticed in the notes. I think you're also going to speak on, Tom. What if? I mean, if I'm the pastor, I can meet with my people. But what if there is somebody becomes a believer and he goes to another church? Do I have the right to? I'll disciple him anyway. The answer is, it depends. It very much depends. I mean, if I know the pastor and he's going to be okay with it, then of course I can go there and say, listen, there's this guy and he wants to meet with me. Is that okay with you? And he will say yes. Yeah? But sometimes it's not that way. It may be, it's a pastor, it may be a very good pastor, but he doesn't think highly of disciple making, and he may say, why would you want to do that? Yeah? Or he may say, I need him, he's a key man. If he starts spending time with you, it'll take him out of activities. No, please not. Yeah? So what do you do then? And I said, there is this, depends on the role and the format. And I think I'll close with that. Is this a scale? Is it more like a key person in the church, or is he more sort of from the sidelines? And the other is, what I'm doing, is it sort of more low-key or very formal? Like if I want to get a key man from somebody else into, like John Musselman had, sort of strongly formalized thing every Friday morning from 6:30 to whatever, 8:30. So if I try to do that with a person here, then of course I have to talk to the pastor. Unless he works in a raving liberal church where the pastor doesn't even think in our terms, yeah? But the more people from the sidelines that the pastor doesn't have a vision for yet, that he isn't even aware of, and the way I go about it is actually fairly casual, yeah? Like the most extreme case is when a friend of mine said, there's this man in our church, I'm discipling him, but he doesn't realize that. That's about as low-key as you can get. That's not what we're advocating here. We're sort of advocating, we want it to be fairly, we want to know, like you can tell somebody, I'm going to take you from the Tower of London to Trafalgar Square. That's what I'm going to do. But theoretically, you could say, let's go for a walk. And for some reason, you end up at Trafalgar Square. That's also a possibility. It's not necessarily the best possibility, but there are people for whom that works wonders, who would have at first told you, I don't want to go to Trafalgar Square, and suddenly that's where they find themselves, and that's also a possibility. So if you have somebody who it's not too methodical and he is not too key in church, and there may be a problem with the pastor because he's liberal or negative or so, you may find yourself doing something that later the pastor will hopefully realize, wow, what happened to this guy? And if he says, well, I did meet with so-and-so, he said, well, in retrospect, I would have said, go for it. Yeah.